So my name is Elisa Vafai. I'm the IAVA Northern California chapter president. And this is the first of a two-part panel that looks at issues impacting the Iranian American community. So our panel is tasked with really laying the foundation and outlining what those core issues are, what we're struggling with. We heard a little bit about hate crimes, but to map out the range of issues that our community is facing. And then also, what our panel is going to do in order to, one, hear about the great work of the speakers and what's happening in the community, but also to set up the next panel, is we're going to also demonstrate and talk about how lawyers are shifting their strategy, not just to be focused on litigation. So if you are working on a community issue, either through your job or through pro bono or through a family case, we are no longer in an era where just filing a lawsuit and pursuing a case is sufficient, right? We're seeing how lawyers are shifting to a multi-pronged strategy. Lawyers are looking at how policy advocacy, media, and many different things are imperative for our clients and for our communities. And just to kick us off before I do intros, to ground us in why that strategy is important, let's look at the travel ban as an example, right? This is a case. How many folks are up to date on the ban? Yes? How many folks read or heard about the devastating Supreme Court decision last June upholding the ban? Great, okay. So we know from the ban, I mean, we litigated this case, and you know, as a community, the different organizations, different states, and we lost at the Supreme Court. And we'll hear a little bit about cases that are moving forward to challenge the implementation of it. But the ban is a great example of how, as lawyers, if we have clients or families or community members, we need more than just litigation. We need policy and media and other matters as well. So I'm going to briefly introduce each speaker, and then we'll dive in and leave some time for Q&A. So the first speaker I want to introduce is Ali Balor. He's immediately to my right. And Ali has been practicing immigration law since 1996. He's the managing attorney of the Balor Immigration Law Group, and he's been an expert and served on the boards of several very prominent immigration organizations and bar associations, ranging from the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the Board of Trustees of the American Immigration Council, and he's a member of the LA County Bar Association and the LGBT Bar Association. And he works on the ban, and we've had the pleasure of getting to know each other through our work on the ban. Next, after Ali, is Dr. Niaz Kasravi. She is a national expert on criminal justice and social justice and racial justice. She has more than 18 years of experience. Her bio and everyone's bio is in the program, but she right now is the founder and director of the Avalon Institute, a research and advocacy and training institute focused on connecting just and objective data to organizations working to create a more just and fair justice system. And she's formerly with the NAACP and Amnesty International. So thank you for joining us. And last but not least, Yagane Torbati. She is a reporter for ProPublica in Washington, D.C. And she covers U.S. federal government, focusing on national security, foreign policy, and immigration. She was formerly with Reuters. And she broke major stories on the ban and on other immigration issues, and has been recognized with many awards listed in the program. So thank you all for being here. And just want to kick us off, if you can please, the first question is geared at making sure that we as an audience understand the core issues the Iranian American community is facing. So if you can outline what you're working on and what you're seeing so that we can get a strong foundation for the next panel. So Ali, I'll start with you.
Sure. Hi, everybody, and thank you for staying up. So my portion is the travel ban, and since I just saw just a few hands as to your familiarity with the ban, I just want to go to the source of the ban, where it came from. Basically, one of the first acts that Donald Trump enacted was the executive order enacting the ban back in 2017. And it went through several incarnations and lives and so forth until the Supreme Court, like Elika said, found that it was actually legal. What ban is today, basically nationals of 7 countries, Iran included, but of course Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Syria, Venezuela, and Yemen are subject to the ban. And the different nationalities are subject to different kind of restrictions. For example, Iranians are able to get F1 student visas, and Syrians aren't really able to get any kind of visa. So there's variations, but the ban is there. But it's important to note that the ban didn't just come out of nowhere, out of Trump's brain. Some variations of the ban has been in existence really since 9/11 and more formally mid-2000s in the format of CARP. So CARP is a little known secret of Homeland Security, which really they just acknowledged it only in 2008, even though it had been kind of a secret since right after 9/11. And as attorneys, we noticed that our Iranian or Middle Eastern cases weren't moving forward for no reason whatsoever. So people sued, and Department of Homeland Security eventually acknowledged that CARP existed. So CARP, and I still have to read it. So CARP stands for Controlled Application Review and Resolution Program, CARRP. And what that means is if you are a suspect from a suspect country, let's say, if you're national of a suspect country, Iran included, chances are there's a good chance that you're asking for a benefit and your case is collecting dust somewhere and nobody's paying attention to it and you're not getting a straight answer and you keep following up and following up. And the only reason we found that CARP existed is because we sued. So that's where travel ban, I think, originated. The origins, as Trump likes to say, came from CARP, I believe. And let's see. Is that a good foundation?
That's a great foundation. Okay. Wonderful. So I think, Ali, what you were getting at is, so one of the core issues our communities is facing is discriminatory background check delays or an inability to get a visa because the country of origin that you come from or your family comes from is considered to be inherently suspect and a national security concern. So whether that policy is the ban, which basically what we're dealing with right now is it's very difficult, and we'll get to the waivers too, but it's very difficult for Iranians to get any visa because of background and security checks through the ban, whether you're dealing with that or whether your family member's already here in the United States and you're going through the immigration process and your case is subjected to discriminatory and oftentimes indefinite background check delays just because of your country of origin, right? So those are some core issues that we're seeing in the community. And just a show of hands, how many folks immigrated here from Iran? Great. And how many folks have family members who did? Awesome. And how many people right now have pending cases, I mean, not for yourselves, but just family members? Okay, so this is a huge issue that impacts everyone, almost everybody in this room in one way or the other. Great, so we covered immigration and background check delays. Niaz, I'm gonna turn it over to you. If you could also please talk about the core issues that you're working on to lay the foundation for the issues we're facing.
Sure. Glad to be here with you today, and I'm super excited that, especially with the IABA, that you're taking this turn of really just looking at these issues in a way that can't no longer be just a legal advocacy or the legal channel that we follow. It really is a multi-pronged approach. So I just want to commend you for that, and Elika also for just spearheading this panel and bringing us all together. When I was thinking about this question about what are the main issues I work on now that impact the Iranian American community, as Elika said, for almost 20 years, I realize that ages me, but I've been working on issues of racial justice, criminal justice, and juvenile justice, and frankly, they are all issues that impact our community and have always impacted our community to different degrees, right? But the source of all of that discrimination that we're feeling, whether it's through the travel ban or other cases that I'm working on, is the same. And so that's something I just wanted to highlight, and we can talk about that more during the Q&A session. But what brings me here today in terms of what I'd like to highlight are two sort of bi-coastal cases that I do justice advocacy around. And one is Cheyenne's case, Shayana Mazrui, who you've heard about today, and as most of you know, he was 22 when he was stabbed to death by a known white supremacist at a local pub here in Orange County. And the other case is that of Bijan Reysar, who in the DC area was shot 9 times by park police officers. He was unarmed, and in fact, he was the victim of a fender bender, a very slight fender bender, and he didn't stop because it was so slight. First of all, we don't exactly know. We can just presume because he is no longer with us. And I think that's what's really tragic about these cases, right? But both cases highlight things that I think for a very long time our community has, to a great extent, felt like this is not our problem. You know, it is mostly African Americans and the Black community who deal with police shootings. No, case in point, you know, Bijan Reysar. Hate crimes doesn't impact us to the extent that it does other communities, Black, Latino, Jewish communities, case in point, Cheyenne. And the reality is that Cheyenne and Bijan could have been any of us, could have been any of our brothers, fathers, uncles, friends, and there is no rhyme or reason why they experienced that and we are sitting here. And I think I'll tell you a little bit about both cases, and we can talk about the more details later. For Cheyenne's case, as you heard, we are finally nearing the trial phase. It was caught up in just really horrendous allegations, which I'm not going to comment on their truth or not, but egregious misconduct by the sheriff's department, which were not proven in court. And based on those allegations, the case was being requested to be dismissed on its, entirely. And so that decision was finally made several months back, and we are moving forward with the trial of Cheyenne's murder, Timber. And as early as next week, jury selection can begin. But I think the one thing that I'll point out is the person who instigated the entire incident, Elizabeth Thornburg, was never charged until, as the district attorney mentioned, 3 days before the statute of limitations ran out, we were finally able to get her charged as accessory after the fact. And that was only because not only the legal advocacy, the lawyers that were involved in both the civil suit and the prosecutor's office finally deciding to do the right thing. We held protests, we had media attention, and we had specific, powerful, well-established members of the community willing to step up and use their power and voice to express to the DA that this is not okay and that our community in Southern California expects more of you. So that's a victory, and that's also a lesson in terms of how we can move some of these issues forward. And quickly on Bijan's case, there is no real progress. There's been 0 answers from the U.S. Park Police about why Bijan was shot. Just a few months ago, we learned through the lawsuit, we learned the officer's identity, and they finally, after 2 years, came out and said they were acting in self-defense, period, no explanation, no other reason. The one good thing, silver lining, I guess slightly, that has happened is that the U.S. Park Police, after much pressure from lawmakers and the media and the family and the community, have said that they are going to review their use of force policy because it is not contemporary, and Bijan's case made them realize that. So these things add up. Progress is slow, but all these issues impact us. And I'm going to stop there because I know we have time for Q&A, and I just want to make sure Yagana John has time.
Thank you. Yeah, and thank you for breaking that down. I think it's really important, just not that we read in the news, but we know in our own communities what cases are happening, right, around police brutality or hate crimes, and that we know those specific cases and are following them and can understand their trajectory and what we can do. We're going to both shift gears and go back a little. So Yegana, I'm going to turn to you to also talk about those issues, but also, what's interesting, and we really appreciate you being on the panel, is you're not an advocate, right? You're a reporter, and there's a neutrality there around your reporting, and yet your reporting has been so critical to much of our advocacy, which we'll talk about later. So would love to hear from you about, again, going back to some of the immigration issues, but some of the issues that you're covering.
Sure. So thank you all for having me. And it's a great point that you raised. My role is not necessarily to advocate for or against the travel ban, but rather I see myself as being someone based in DC, covering the federal government, to find out as much information as I can about how it's being implemented, why it's being implemented. And that's been, for most of the past 3 years, much of my focus. And so I just want to there's a lot we could talk about, but just to kind of touch on the waiver issue. I think what we're seeing with the waivers, which it looks like for at least the next year that's going to be the process that's in place, though it's injected a huge amount of arbitrariness into the immigration process for people who are of the travel ban nationalities. If you have access to a lawyer, if you have access to people who can advocate for you on the congressional level, if you quite bluntly have the resources and the money to be able to wage a battle, you are able to make your case for a waiver. And if you don't have those things, there's not much that you can do. I mean, I've seen emails from the State Department to applicants, to attorneys saying, please do not submit materials for to prove that you are eligible for a waiver. We will automatically consider you for one. And then I've come across other cases, especially, there's some well-publicized ones. There was an article in the New York Times a while back about some actors, Syrian and Iranian actors, who wanted to come to the United States to put on a play, I believe on Broadway or just off Broadway. They were allowed to submit reams of information, letters from Benedict Cumberbatch and Sting saying this is why these people should deserve to come here. And that was sort of presented as a feel-good story. And it is for those people, but I think it also has created a more unequal system. And probably for you all, that not everyone has access to an immigration attorney, so it was always perhaps an unequal system, but certainly it has made things more uneven, at least from the reporting that I've been able to do. And because there's no form for a waiver, as there are for other types of waivers in the immigration system, there's just no one standard way to actually apply. It seems quite arbitrary, and getting answers out of the State Department on this issue has been extremely difficult. We are seeing, I think, the numbers of waivers pick up. I believe they've automated some of those processes, but it's still, it's definitely not at all the way that it was pre-travel ban, of course. And then I just wanted to kind of tie back to what Ali was saying earlier, regarding sort of the policies that were in place pre-Trump that laid some of the foundation for the travel ban and the use of sort of national security arguments when it comes to immigration. So CARP, as he laid out really clearly, was one of the bases for that. There was also the bill that President Obama signed, I think, removing some visa waiver privileges for people who had traveled to the same countries that were on the first travel ban list. And I think that over time I've realized that the Trump administration, in making its arguments for the travel ban and for other policies, very much borrows from prior administrations and their use of similar arguments. And I think that the challenge for me as a reporter, and perhaps for you all, is to just keep that in mind as we, eventually move past the Trump administration, that these are things that are kind of with us in American politics and policy, and that we should all sort of be very conscious of kind of the mixing of immigration and national security issues.
There we go. So thank you so much for outlining just where we are with the waivers. And I did want to layer on a bit that, the waivers, how many folks are familiar with the waiver process? Okay, great. Right, so we know that what we're dealing with is, after the Supreme Court decision, implementation of the ban, and the visas are only available through this waiver process. And just to layer on that, while there is also policy and media advocacy that we need to do in order to get those waivers, there is also lawsuits happening. So IABA, other organizations, National Immigration Law Center, Asian Law Caucus CARE, and a few firms, there is a class action challenging the implementation of that. And we're fighting that in court and kind of duking it out. And it's not the ideal litigation, right? Nobody wants the waivers, but it's what we're left with as a community. And so it's really important to seek accountability on the waivers and those pieces, but unfortunately it's been quite tied up by the government in court. But please follow IABA for updates on that as well. And then I think, Gana, the policy you were talking about was HR 158, right? And looking at where those...
I don't actually remember the name of the bill, but yeah.
Yes, exactly. So what we're looking at is, well, we have a myriad of immigration issues, whether that's national security background checks. We have a long-standing policy issues and how Iranians are viewed that impact what we can litigate and how we can litigate. We have issues of hate crimes, issues of police brutality, and those are some of what we're struggling with. So let's shift gears a little bit, because as lawyers, what we wanted to make sure that we walk away with is more creative thinking about different strategies that we can use outside of the courts, since these issues are so difficult to challenge in court. And so I'm gonna ask each of the panelists to please speak about how they have used a multi-pronged approach. How have they used media or policy advocacy to address those issues? So Adley, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So since not many people are familiar with the actual waiver and the ban process, there's 3 prongs to it. So the first prong is, in order to get a waiver, you have to show that the person has some kind of a benefit to the U.S. The second prong is there has to be some kind of a hardship, and it's really vague as to whose hardship, if it's a U.S. citizen, if it's the foreign national, if it's a U.S. entity, who knows, but hardship needs to be there. So there's a lot of documentation that goes into proving those 2. But the third prong, which I think is the national security aspect of it, is a black hole, because that's decided out of Washington. So when attorneys prepare the waivers, we submit it at every stage of the game. So initially at the National Visa Center, when the petition is approved, and then it's transferred to the National Visa Center, I submit my waiver. I follow it through when it's sent to the U.S. consulate, and I follow it through when it's set up for a visa. But in the background, more towards what Elika was talking about, what else am I doing? I'm also putting my client in touch with their representative in Congress, and I kind of researched the representative. For example, and I can just say in California, I had a client recently that had some contacts in the Washington, D.C. area and had some contacts in the California area, so I could use both. And I went to the senator in Maryland, and I went to the actual office in D.C. and I presented my case. And it was a very heart-wrenching case. And they actually called me like 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, while I was in the hallways of the Senate. And they told me, we're being very honest with you. We can't do anything because nobody cares if your client's going to die. That's exactly what they told me. And so I literally shifted gears. I marched over to Kamala Harris's office. I'm not plugging Kamala Harris by any means. I'm nonpartisan. But her office took a different approach. I thought she has an election coming up, so she might actually pay attention to her constituents. I presented my case to her office. They were very interested. I left D.C., and really my waiver was approved within a week. Within days, I should say. Her representative called me on the metro. While she was on the metro, she got the news. She called me while on the metro. She got cut off a few times. She goes, "I'm so happy, I'm jumping up and down." I go, I'm jumping up and down with you. Thank you very much. So I researched the congressional person to see what, if any, help they can be. I also reach out to the media. Media can be extremely helpful. Of course, whenever you mention media, the clients always hesitant because they don't want to bring attention to themselves. Being, within the Iranian community, we're extremely hesitant of the media because of the background of our culture that, it's a police state that we have in Iran. So because of that, they're constantly thinking that somebody's going to come out. So you have to educate your client, say, it's okay, this will help you, and present the facts to the media. Have developed a relationship with your local media, with the reporters. So when you do have a case, you have an email to send, you have a phone call to make, and maybe somebody's going to be interested. If the story gets out and somebody picks it up, miracles happen.
Exactly. So, I mean, they don't train us in media and advocacy in law school, right? But we're like lawyering in a time where if I get a travel ban case, filing in court or going to court is really not, I'm not doing a service to my client in that way, right? And I don't have that many options. And so thinking, okay, now as a lawyer, I need to know who my elected reps are. I need to have an analysis and an understanding of my elected reps. I need to be comfortable with media. I need to train my clients on how to be comfortable with media. I mean, that's the lawyering that we're talking about that we need to do in this era. So thank you, Ali, for breaking that down with a few stories. I'm gonna switch order and actually go Yegane because your content is also tied a little bit to the travel ban a bit more in those pieces. And so, your case is a bit different in terms of you're not advocating, but just as we're getting more used to media as lawyers, just thought it would be helpful to hear from your perspective.
Sure.
Thoughts on this?
I mean, so I started reporting on the travel ban on January 27th, 2017, when it was signed, and the next day I was at Dulles Airport, trying to interview people as they, after hours and hours and hours, were finally released. And that was difficult. I had a huge advantage because I could speak Persian, and the vast majority of people detained at Dulles were Iranian, and there were a couple other nationalities, but mostly Iranian. But very few people wanted to be on the record or have their full name. People were very, very hesitant. They wanted to talk about what they had been through, but the idea of appearing in a news story, some people balked at that. That has completely changed over the last 2.5 years. I mean, to the point where I feel bad because I have people coming to me all the time wanting me to tell their stories, and I just, no one reporter has the ability to write about all of these cases. And so I really agree with your strategy of looking for local reporters too, like the LA, you guys have great local newspapers here, including the LA Times and others, and those reporters are also able to write about these cases in a really full way and bring kind of the local perspective. But yeah, I think that, of course, journalism and advocacy, they have two different roles, but I think advocates and activists open the space for journalists to be able to do their work. I think this is really true with the Me Too issues, where there was a lot of people had chased that story about Harvey Weinstein years before the New York Times and the New Yorker actually did it. But in the meantime, there had been a lot of advocacy and activism around sexual harassment to the point where people felt comfortable going forward eventually. And that's partially what enabled those reporters to do that story. And I think over the past 2.5 years or so, activism within the Iranian American community, within immigrant communities, has made those communities more comfortable with speaking out and using their voices. And that has made my job as a reporter very, very different than what it was in 2017.
Absolutely. And so really explicitly, just to name, Yegane broke a story last March in 2018 on the waivers. And for those of us, if you remember the timeline of the ban going back, the Supreme Court back in December of 2018, so before the final decision, 2017, thank you, lifted the injunction. And so we were seeing all these denials and what was happening, and we knew that the waiver process was functionally a sham, but we couldn't articulate it with data. And when Yegane's story broke about the less than 2%, that shifted a lot of our advocacy. So Yegane, I'm also just curious if you can touch on one point we chatted about, which was just how you're looking at your coverage overall.
Yeah, I mean, so that was an important story because that was the first time I believe that any data about the travel ban waiver rate had come out. And so we were at Reuters, which was where I was when I broke that story, we were unused to reporting on it in that way. And so that the first story was very difficult for us, just getting the information and then thinking like, okay, how do we trust this? How do we contextualize it? And then I think it was cited in the Supreme Court arguments, and we got updated data kind of in the months after that. And then I think one point I also wanted to raise though was that like the policy and data reporting that we're able to do is much more powerful if we can also pair it with a narrative, and that's where the cases of your clients come through, or cases that we're able to find. I mean, that for that one story, that was like a bit of an exception, but then later stories where I wrote about the travel ban waiver rate, I could pair it with, okay, and this is like a real person who's going through this. This is, one of these numbers belongs to this person, and this is how it affects them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the importance of us as community knowing our story, our narrative, and pushing that forward is so key. So thank you. I'm going to switch gears now and go back to Niaz. If you can give us an example of how you use a multi-pronged strategy to advance your work.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was sitting here listening to you guys talk, and I know there are some attorneys in the Iranian American community, but much broader, really focusing on the issue of movement lawyering. And I know some of us have been working with those attorneys, and I think if you are interested to kind of dive into how you actually pursue legal cases within a larger movement that takes into account advocacy and media and political grassroots organizing, things like that, I think that's a really great space to explore, and us advocates really appreciate that perspective coming from the legal field. But I think back to a couple of, the way that we're approaching these two cases, I think back to a couple of different victories we've had through the years, right? So we were able to free a man who was serving an unjust sentence in the state of Georgia several years back when I was at the NAACP. And we actually had some conflict with his attorney because he didn't particularly understand the importance of why is the NAACP involved, why are they trying to make a big deal out of this? I'm just trying to go in the court and do my wheeling and dealing and prove the case and get out. So there was some work to be done. I think we're much more ahead of that now, particularly around some of these issues that we're talking about. But some of the components that both Ali and Yegana highlighted are, I believe, kind of pieces of a puzzle of a multi-pronged approach to tackling these issues, right? We talked about the grassroots organizing, really working with the community to actually understand and be able to express what their desire and demands are to their lawmakers. It's political organizing, working with lawmakers to change the policy and spearhead change. It's definitely media and social media component are important pieces of it. And there's the legal advocacy piece around particular cases or issues that move forward. But one of the ways that in these two cases, one of the things that I've been proud of that we've been able to accomplish is really work with a diverse coalition of groups coming from across different communities, right? So because of the spaces that I've been in, I was able to identify partners at the NAACP, at Amnesty International, at Mothers Against Police Brutality, at Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, people who are not often on a regular basis standing with us around these issues and these cases. But imagine if we all had those connections, right? If we recognize that what is happening to our community, whether it's the travel ban, whether it's hate crimes, as in Shayan's case, or police brutality, as in Bijan's case, is a product of racism and white supremacy. And that's what these groups have been fighting. We have to name it. And I know there's different politics that you gotta think through as you're building your campaign around language, but that's the bottom line. And many communities have been fighting these issues for hundreds of years in this country, right? So we're not alone. And so I think of all the components, the one that I'm squarely centered in and always pushing is that coalition building so that when something, yes, it's important that folks show up and stand with us when something happens to one of us, right? And it's important for us to show up and it's a moral thing, right? So absolutely, we have to do that. But that relationship shouldn't just be a one-off. If we continue to deliberately show up in these spaces, show up for someone who gets shot and killed, who is not Iranian American, someone who gets deported, who is not Iranian American, someone who's a victim, you built those relationships so that when, unfortunately, these things come back home and hit us, we have support. And I think that's one of the key things that I would like to highlight as you're thinking about how to approach a lot of these cases and campaigns.
Yeah, absolutely. And to tie it back to the legal work and the ban, I mean, the thousands of folks that showed up at the airports, that made a difference, right? And the urgency around getting the injunctions at the time. And so what does showing up and building coalition mean? Also, I know the next panel is going to talk about the strong coalitions being built within the Iranian American community, and that's really important as well. But also wanted to layer on that the lawsuit challenging the waivers isn't just asking for accountability on the waivers just for Iranians, right? So the lawsuit that IABA is a part of is asking for accountability on behalf of all the individuals of all the countries that are impacted by the ban. And so thinking about, how do we build coalitions, that's a great example. We have National Immigration Law Center, for example, as a key partner in that. And they also litigate immigration policies and executive orders at the Supreme Court right now as well. So I'm going to open it up for questions. And if not, I'm going to recap it. Any questions?
Every week. And every week we have news and we have a new policy that's going on. So we are kind of like, we don't have the luxury of the time anymore. So as an advocate, I want to be active, but I think the communities, we have to give away that at this point, at this juncture, we are going to have this event, this event, this event. Because every week, there are so many things happening. And then working 60 plus hours a week doesn't leave you that much room either. So I'm hearing some of my colleagues, actually, they have PTSD at this time. Because we have the border, we have all this issue going on. As people that they are leading this movement, leading the movement, I really appreciate it. If you guys kind of give us the heads up, this is more important, this is important, come to this event, because then we become a cohesive group. I really appreciate that one.
Sure, of course. I think there's so many great, whether you follow the different organizations speaking here through social media, et cetera, action alerts, et cetera. I think we're all struggling with that capacity, and it's coming from many different angles, and that just means that we as lawyers being more engaged on that is just ever more important. Yeah, thank you to our panel speakers. I'm going to close it out at this point so we can stay on track. But thank you for outlining the core issues that we're facing and really helping us creatively think about how we use media, how do we build coalitions, how do we get more involved in the policy process when filing lawsuits is just not going to cut it for our community issues and what we need to see moving forward. So thank you again.